All right, and we are officially live on Twitch. Hello, world. Welcome, welcome to How to Write Adventure Modules That Don't Suck. So we're going to do a brief round of introductions, and then we have the chat function enabled, and then we'll take some questions. We also prepped. We asked people to give feedback, so we have a couple of emails from folks who had some topics they wanted to cover. But first, introductions. My name is Joseph Goodman of Goodman Games. I published stuff and wrote a few things as well. Who's next?
Sure, I'll go. Michael Curtis, obviously with Goodman Games, otherwise I wouldn't be here. Writing for Adventure Club Classics, for original Adventure Reincarnated, for 5th edition Fantasy, for Metamorphosis Alpha, for everything and everything.
All right, Great Babe is ready.
Oh, great, baby's ready. Okay, let us finish our introduction, then we'll circle back to you.
Cool. Brendan LaSalle. I also write adventures for Goodman, including DCC, old DCC, and every stage of X-Crawl.
Hey everybody, Chris Doyle. I've been freelancing for Goodman Games since 2004. I wrote original DCC and currently writing 5e material.
I'll go next. I'm Marc Brunner. I've been writing for Goodman Games since 2016. Just a few adventures here and there for DCC, MCC, Dinosaur Crawl Classics, if you're familiar with that. And most recently, the Dying Earth project I'm leading up with the help of Terry Olson and Bob Brennan and Julian McCracken.
Hi everybody, I'm Terry Olson. I've been writing for Goodman Games, I guess, 2012 or 2013, something like that. You've probably cursed my name in DCC RPG tournaments that have been at the last few Gen Cons. I write for Lankmar and Dying Earth and Purple Planet, and some short adventures you've seen back of larger adventures and free RPG games.
All right. Now, guys, I got a little feedback that we're all sounding a little quiet. So apparently I'm the loudest one. Don't know why, but as you guys talk, let's just try to be a little more vocal and articulate.
Ooh, that's dangerous.
Yeah. So first thing we're going to do is, let's see now. Actually, Chris, say something, and let's ask the audience if they can hear you.
Hey everybody, how's everybody doing?
Now, can you guys hear Chris?
A bunch of Ys. Yep.
Yes. Okay. So they can definitely hear you here in the Zoom, and the folks on Twitch say barely. So I will play a little bit around with that in a minute. First, we're going to take our first question. Grape Ape, you had a question earlier, so I'm going to actually unmute you, and then feel free to talk. Grape Ape, you should be unmuted and able to talk.
Yes, gentlemen, thank you. So when you're building an adventure module, how do you guys have a certain setup? Like there's an introduction, there's a background, here's the pre-generated characters. What's kind of the default layout that you guys go by, and how much does each of those sections consist of?
It's a good question.
And whoever wants to take it, you guys dive in. I'm actually going to mute myself so that I don't take over the audio accidentally. And we should remind ourselves to mute when we're not talking. But whoever wants to take it, jump on in.
So I can jump in first. So, you know, it's almost different every time. Sometimes we'll have just a very small blurb, like a paragraph we'll want to go off of, and then we'll sort of structure things around that. Other times there'll be an idea of a map, and the idea of the map, the adventure will come through that. Or sometimes it's encounter based, where I'll have an idea for a super cool finale, and I'll write that encounter, and then I'll sort of start tying encounters into that. So there's not, for me at least, there's not a set methodology or pattern to each adventure.
Yeah. If you're asking about like the actual structure, I definitely go back to the early modules and sort of go adventure background, encounters all the way through the actual room things. I guess I don't really do it the same way every time, but depending on what I'm working on, those sections aren't always the same size. The content is absolutely going to develop, going to dictate how long any given section should be. So we're almost always working under an actual word count total, so that dictates much more what you can put into what section because you have to have X number of words to fill up, your encounters or the actual room breakdown or the background. So to me, the word count is actually a bigger decider for what gets how much space those things take up. How many words?
Yeah, and I think great, Babe, you typed in chat, are there things that you make sure you're including in every module? I think kind of echoing what Brendan said is that going back to kind of the format of DCC is really helpful, to see the introduction, player's background, starting information. I haven't done this as much as the other guys, but typically I'm very focused on preserving that sort of format because it gives me a structure, even if I'm not ready to write, any of that content. But leaving a placeholder for those things, like the encounter table for me is a kind of a one that I always make sure I include, but that's usually towards the end. But I'm always kind of thinking in terms of that the module structure that first started with some of the early DCC RPG modules that obviously came from before that as well. So I try to when I write stuff, I try to keep to that format generally, and even if I'm not writing that stuff at the beginning, and I'm just making sure there's a placeholder for it.
And I'll just jump in real quick. So when we're writing for the original Adventures Reincarnated, since that's a licensed project from Wizards of the Coast, that actually is very structured and it is very specific as far as what sections are and what like some of the things like the way we do our encounter tables, the way we present the encounters. So that's a little bit different than the DCC modules, which are a little bit more freeform. So it all depends on what specific product line you're working on.
Actually, Chris, that's a great. Or sorry, Mike, were you going to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's very interesting for me because working on the fifth edition stuff and the DCC stuff, and I also came into Goodman just as we were doing the transition from the 3.5 years back to the fourth edition years into DCC RPG. So in that period, there was definitely the encounter table that was it was still a relic from the 3.5 years, and then it kind of fell out of kind of fell by the wayside a little bit, for DCC because it wasn't quite as necessary to block everything out. But then having to do everything with the ore line and the fifth edition fantasy, there's definitely his own structure there. Where with DCC, things are a little more loosey goosey, and just because of I think more of the fan base. Anything, I think people have different expectations for different lines.
And that leads into another question we have in the Q&A, which is tips for creating adventures for DCC that feel like DCC material. I'll just throw out there to start with reading appendix in literature, just picking one or two or three authors from that list, reading 2 or 3 or 4 of their books, and just trying to capture that feel. And as much as you can go broad base, because a lot of what's interesting about Appendix N is it covers a lot of what we consider different genres these days. Back in the day, it was all one mixed genre. Now we call it science fiction or horror or fantasy. But if you go through that and kind of just pick 3 or 4 randomly, you'll probably cross many of the genre lines that we consider today. And that's a good way to get a sense of writing something that feels DCC, which really just means it feels like speculative literature from 50 to 100 years ago. And anybody else feel free to answer that as well.
Try to stat some of the things that you're reading. The things that you're reading. Try to come up with some stat block or game mechanics or something that you think conveys the feel of stuff that you're reading, and you'll start moving towards that vibe.
I would say sometimes you have to specifically reject the conventions of like the classic era of like Dungeons and Dragons style adventures, so don't feel like you have to have a monster in every room. You have to have rooms with this many things, and every monster has to have a certain amount of treasure in there, otherwise it doesn't feel balanced. I think try to balance. I try to when I do a DCC thing to make it feel like a DCC thing. I try to balance out the adventure as a whole rather than one single encounter. Putting myself in that mindset of like one great big story that isn't all just broken down into a bunch of little rooms that have to have a just right combination of treasure and traps and hazards and everything. That really helps me.
And something what I do is I pay attention to language, the language that I use when I'm writing the adventure, especially like the read aloud text and such, because you have, I mean, the various kind of appendix and authors have, some of them have very distinctive language. You had mainly Wade Wellman doing his kind of North Carolina, twang to what he's writing. Leiber had a definitely sense that he was doing. I'm sure Mark can tell you a whole bunch of stories about incorporating Vance's vocabulary in Dying Earth, But if I'm trying to at least allude back to a specific source material as kind of the inspiration, I will take note of, if there's an unusual word or an interesting word or something that the author uses, I will make note of that and make sure that I kind of squeeze it in during the writing process.
That's an awesome point.
Yeah, and then for those of us that are that look up to like Harley and Michael as writers, we often go back and read their early their modules for that kind of inspiration. So I found myself doing that as well, like going back and reading some of just rereading Sailors and seeing the kind of language that Harley's incorporating in that. That makes me feel more in the framework of what DCC is for the context of what I'm trying to get across. So that's kind of like a second degree of association, in that term.
Cool. Now we have somebody raising their hand. I'm gonna unmute Michael Boland. Let's see. So Mike, if you unmute yourself, you should be able to chat.
Yep, I am chatting.
Hey Mike, how's it going?
Hey, pretty good. I have had the great opportunity to playtest stuff for at least 4 of you before publication, and I'm wondering what do you how do you know when it's ready to kind of send out to that third party, to another group to take a look at, and how do you help guide them in the feedback that you get?
As George Lucas has taught us, nothing is ever finished. So, basically, we send it out when we start getting angry emails from Joe. No, I'm just. No, I mean, you can drive yourself nuts, because whatever you end up putting down on the paper is not going to meet whatever you had in your head when the whole process started. So it just has to be, deadline does play a big part of it, but there gets to be a point of like, okay, this is good enough. I think. Basically, if I get it to the point where it doesn't look like it's going to fall apart immediately, at that point I think I'm ready to start playtesting it. So that's the point where I'm willing to send it out to you. And Mike, I need something I need playtested before this is over. So if you have some free time.
I don't know if you can still hear me. Sure, I'll do it. I only have like 2 seminars and a game to play tomorrow, so I'm sure.
I need 15 minutes before the seminar is over. I need to play.
Okay, sweet. Gotcha.
I work. Let's see if I can undo something. No. I work the opposite from that. I will sketch an adventure out just in my notebook, and then I'll try to play test it as much as possible. At least 5 or 6 times before I actually start writing it and start committing it to paper. So I feel like there comes a point when I'm running. If you run it enough times, there comes a point where it starts to feel really good, and you're like, all right, this is. I've got a solid adventure here, and it can. If it can still go off in a bunch of different directions, but still be really fun for everyone to do, then to me that's when I feel like, all right, I can either pitch it if I haven't pitched it yet, and actually send an email to Joseph and be like, hey, this is the thing I want to do, blah 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 blah. Or if it's something that's already in discussion, like, hey, I want to do an extra adventure for this level, da 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 da. That's when I'll start committing it to paper. But for me, the playtesting starts. I try to do as much playtesting as I can before I actually write.
All right, Mike, I'm going to remute you, nothing personal. And just to say it sounds like we have fixed the audio problems on Twitch, and the magic answer was unplugging my earbuds. So, very sophisticated technology here. So I'm going to answer one of the questions from the Q&A thread. Somebody asked, this is pretty straightforward, word count for an adventure. This is, lessons learned over many years, but essentially 10,000 words equals approximately 16 printed pages. 20,000 words equals approximately 32 printed pages, and so on. That's a general rule of thumb that I found works out for at least the way we lay out adventures and so on. And now, guys, I'm going to pitch another question to you, whoever wants to take this. Superhorse asks, statting NPCs and creatures has always been the hardest part for me. Any advice?
think Terry needs to handle this one. He statted more monsters than anybody in this.
I don't know. I guess it's hard to answer without knowing what's difficult about it. So, I think the first thing, if you find yourself lost, go to the back of the DCC rulebook and look at the creatures there and find something that is most like what you're trying to do, and use that as a launching point, or some favorite adventure you have. Use those. Like I will tell you, and I am not afraid to admit it, that one of my favorite monsters ever written, and I'm not just kissing up, is Joseph's Tile Golem and the Emerald Enchanter. Like, I think this is one of the most brilliant creatures because it's fun to fight and it's also fun to play. The GM has all these options to do with it, And so I've used that as sort of a spiritual guide on how I stat other things. A lot of the times it just comes to, like I said, reading things and trying to put those abilities down on paper, and DCC is so swingy. Don't get hung up on, what particular die you're going to use for damage, or should this be +2 or +3. The thing is, make the creatures unique and find a way to surprise the players. Find something that's gonna shock them. Either an attack that comes out of nowhere, a hand comes out of the chest and grabs somebody, or there's some death throw. One time I've had creatures that when they die, they form another creature if enough of them are killed, and so characters have to figure out how to get past the creatures without killing everything. I mean, it's not the most concrete advice, I know, but I would say read and try to adapt and use pre-existing creatures as templates and see if that can sort of boost you up.
And guys, Superhorse asked to clarify his question. So, Superhorse, I'm going to unmute you, and you should be able to talk now.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Terry. That does actually help a lot. But I think a little more, I would like to hear a little bit more on stats in particular, because I do like your advice that's like, instead of worrying about stats, you should focus on uniqueness and surprises. But when you're running like really high level adventures, or you're running, like we're talking like 7th, 8th level, stuff like that, where you get to the point where I want to make sure some of my stuff doesn't die right out the gate. I want to make sure some stuff poses a challenge. Like, how much does that arithmetic play into when you're designing an adventure? Like, how long do I need these things to last? Or is it like, if they die, they die? You know what I mean?
If you're designing for DCC, you better be, if they die, they die. Because
right.
There's absolutely no predicting what can happen when a DCC, warrior maxes out his D die and does something super clever. When the wizard, does a whole bunch of spell burn and brings down like heaven and earth upon your monsters there. You just can't get hung up on it, because it is very swingy. And I've had creatures that have for higher level things, I've had creatures that have been for one group, that's one of the things though. I think this is building on what Terry said, is that DCC isn't really a math equation like there is in some games. You know what I'm saying? Like, I designed a whole lot of monsters for Pathfinder back in the day, and there really is a balance of math there that you have to do that just doesn't come up in DCC. And one of the things about DCC is that superior play wins the day again and again and again. I have a 10th level. I have a 10th level monster that I thought was a world beater for the one time I tried running 10th level adventures out there. And I had several just total party-wise, groups of 10th level characters. And then I had a few who just, got clever and just annihilated it in a go, I mean, think about divine intervention. That's going to really change up, any kind of encounter. A cleric can be like, well, I'm going to have God actually directly intervene and see how that works. So, obviously make them imposing. Sometimes I even, like, if I'm sitting down to a playtest, I will come up with creatures that I think are almost impossible to beat, and then I will watch them get beaten again and again and again and again and again through superior play. So, don't think of how long you want it to last for. Best story. That should be the end of the day, is how cool is it? Oh my God, this thing came through and it was a tile golem and it did this. Man, we had to use, scrubbing bubbles on it or whatever. However you kill a tile golem, I don't even know. But, go for impact rather than anything else, in a good story.
Yeah, I just want to. My advice is really quick. Is what I've learned is that if you have a monster statted out and you're looking at the stats, and you're like, okay, this looks like this is going to be a good. This looks like a good challenge. Bump everything up. That's just it. It's just because it's not. It's add another +2 to the attack bonus. Give it 3 more hit dice. And bump all the saving throws up by 1. And then if there's a DC involved, bump that up by 1 or 2 points. And then prepare for it to get stomped anyway. But that's a good rule of thumb. If you think it's hard enough, it's not.
So let me just give one quick anecdote. So when I was playtesting Violence for Vodashal, one of the Lankmar adventures, Jeff Goad was at my table. I don't know if he's in the webinar, but I'm sure he knows what I'm going to talk about. He saved, of course, like any con game, he saved all his stats. He was playing a Black Wizard until the very last encounter against the big bad, and then spellburned himself down to a feeble wreck, and rolled a 67 on magic missile, whatever. But he just annihilated my big bad in a round. And while I wanted to, I don't want to stop that, right? I mean, a player should have his due. But what I did do after the playtest is give that baddie something that I called spellburn resistance, where I made a little mechanic where the more a wizard burns, the greater the chance that this thing is going to resist what he does. So there's a little risk for that person that saves everything to the end. So you can do something like that. Don't squash a player, but if you want to increase your monster's chance of survival, try to meet somewhere in the middle.
All right, guys, these are great answers. I'm gonna and thanks, man, for asking your questions. I'm gonna mute you again now.
Yeah, thank
Super
you.
Horse. Okay. And I'm going to pitch one to Chris now to start off. This one can go for either DCC or 5e, or really any kind of adventures. But Robert asks, can y'all talk about how important you think developing multiple opening hooks are for an adventure?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I design hooks, I do like to have a couple different hooks in there. I mean, you can always start with the old, you start in a tavern, yada, yada, yada. But really what I like to do with hooks is I like to really just kind of get some adventure seeds that the game master that can then take and run with. So, throw a couple sentences on here like, oh, maybe, the party gets, rowdy instead of just starting off at the bar, they get rowdy at the bar and they get into a fight and then they're thrown in jail. And then to get out of jail, they have to, do whatever the mayor wants them to do. So, but, just taking that and giving that and letting the game master run with that in their own campaign. And if you can give 3 or 4 of those kind of interesting, I think that really kind of makes it for a really good transition from the beginning of the adventure, the background, right into the opening encounters.
Cool. Anybody else want to throw out anything on that one?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I don't like concrete plot hooks. It's something that I've developed kind of over the years. Because when I first started doing this, it's like, okay, yeah, you meet in the tavern, whatever like that. But over the years, what you learn from writing and playing in that is that the game master knows their players better than the writer is ever going to do. So if you have it's like, okay, well, they're going to go to the big tower because there's a whole bunch of treasure there, and that's going to be the plot hook. What about if everybody in that party is playing like righteous paladins and do-gooders and stuff, and they don't care about treasure, they want to do something else, so it's, as Chris said, if you have multiple plot hooks, that's good, but at the same time, I wouldn't flesh them out, like you wouldn't want 3 paragraphs per plot hook, and have 3 plot hooks, because right there we're on page 3 now of the adventure and it hasn't even started yet. So I think if you're writing for commercial release, not for just because if you're writing for your players, to get your players anyway. But if you're writing for a kind of an unknown audience, the broader the kind of the instead of a plot hook, use a plot net is what I'm saying. Is basically
That's great.
Yeah, I mean that's great advice of just letting the game master specifically kind of tailor it to his group. He knows his group the best, and certain things like at a convention, you really don't even want to spend much time on it. You want to get them right to the action.
So you even want to kind of just like, just sometimes not even do the plot hook and just drop them right into that first encounter and get them off and going. If you've got a 3-hour or 4-hour game, don't waste a half hour on the, hanging out in the bar before the action starts. So it all depends on your specific game, on your target audience, and you want to vary that up. And then at the same token, if it's a home game, maybe you're going to spend 2 hours on that plot hook and before you actually even get to into the action. Based on what your players like to do if they're hardcore role players. So really knowing your target audience is probably a great starting point.
It's also fun to throw in a hook for a sequel, so like you don't think so much about the hook getting the PCs into the adventure, but within the adventure you put in things that can provide hooks for the judge to what to do after this adventure is over. If the PCs have gathered this funny ring or they found this fragment of a map or whatever. There can be devices that are hooks for where to go next. Sometimes that's a fun thing to write in.
I just want to quick bounce off something that Chris said is that, kind of just to get the throw right in. One of the adventures that I did is at Massive Life Bar. When I run that at convention, it's actually written in the adventure itself. Is literally it starts in media res. It starts with the characters in like just outside a big vault inside of a nobleman's mansion, and they're all there to rob it at the same time. And the guards come in, so it immediately starts with a fight. And when I ran at conventions, we would run the fight, and then it was over. I would ask everybody at the table, okay, how did you get into the mansion, and why are you here? And just go around the table. And, giving the players an agency just to kind of describe how they got hooked into it is a great trick, and your players will really appreciate that too, especially if you're, if it's at a convention, you don't really know everybody, giving them kind of a way to get involved into it without having to sit and listen to you read box text for, 5 minutes. That's a great little trick that has worked for me. I like it.
Yeah, that's great. That's a good one. Okay, we have another question here. I think this has got to be for either Terry or Mark. Maybe you guys can ping pong on it. But the question is, how do you know when a puzzle is too difficult?
You go first, Mark. I took the static.
Yeah, so those of you that don't know, I've also helped with Terry and with Harley run the last few iterations of the Gen Con tournament. And so puzzles are like a bread and butter of that, and it's really difficult. Play tests are so important because you find out something you think is like easy in your mind. That's the worst trap to fall into for me. I have the solution. It's an elegant solution. It's obvious for those, for players if they just sit down and think. What you don't understand is that players often aren't in the same mind space that you are as a writer, right? Because they're at a convention table, they're at a time pressure, they're feeling the clock tick. And they are just grasping at straws, and they want to solve the puzzle, and you're trying to help them, but playtests are just critical for assessing that balance. But even then, I think that what we found is some solutions you often have to have like an alternative that's kind of a backdoor that's maybe a more expensive way of doing it, right? Some cost associated with it, but you always want to give the players you don't want them banging their head against the wall and feeling so frustrated they can't solve something. But you also, in the tournament setting, of course, you're not there. You're impartial. You're not trying to lean in like you might be in a campaign or you might be in your home games where you can sort of, hey, I'll give you, there's an out for you in this. But in the tournament setting, I think it's also important to kind of look at it in the context of, well, maybe they can get around it, but it's going to really be a price, and that means that they're going to pay that, in some context in the tournament, whether it's points or whether it's stats or something like that. I always look to Terry as like the bar for puzzles because his often are that level of frustration that reaches whatever is 25% of the tables that just are not going to pass over that bar without going that out, and whatever that metric is that we've gotten good at, like with Deal, you want it to be certainly challenging enough, but you also want enough people to get through it to where it's it feels like a real solution, but it's not like an absolute barrier. And I don't know, Terry, you've done so many good works on those puzzles, but I assume that's a lot of playtesting as well.
Yeah, and you covered all the main points, right? I mean, there should never be only one solution like that. That's key. There should be a backdoor. Thieves are the only class in DCC that with burning a little luck can get skill checks of 30 or even higher. So find a way to provide an alternate solution that will burn the thief down to the ground in terms of resources. Find other ways. A very high-powered knock spell, whatever. But it's too hard. This sounds trivial, but it's too hard if no one can get it. The goal of writing a puzzle is not to stump people. It's to give them a challenge that they feel good about getting past, and that might mean some tables don't do it, but that will help the tables that do it. So if no one can solve it and no one can even come close or come even be on the right train of thought, then you need to do some redesigning or rethinking about the puzzle.
I will say it is interesting seeing the puzzles play out at Gen Con, because we do get, usually you play with one group or maybe a second group, but at Gen Con we get a statistical sampling of sometimes as many as 100 people, or 20 or 30 groups trying to tackle each puzzle. So it's interesting, I think, to see how some of them, some groups, 80% of them do solve the puzzles, and other times nobody does. It's a good way to find out just how hard it is. Mike just made a comment in the chat that the puzzle should make people feel smart, which I think is a good one. If your players walk away feeling happy and feeling smart, that's probably good.
And one thing I love about DCC is that oftentimes you'll also see examples of puzzles that have a very sort of tactile feel about them. I think that Michael, one of the great things that I liked about some of his work is that he'll often include elements like get the Play-Doh out and start manipulating something, or Terry's puzzle where you start putting decadedrons together and things like that. And I love that that's sort of it's taking the challenge outside of the space of their mind and into something solid. And I think DCC often has really good examples of that. So I love those kind of examples of puzzles as well.
Yeah, actually on that note, if you go back to a certain number of TSR modules, which we'll be talking about in another seminar, but I don't know what the count is, but every so often TSR would have an adventure that had a mini game set inside it, or it wasn't, they weren't as preoccupied with following these exact rules for a role-playing game. You could sort of break out of those rules and do alternate styles. And they encouraged flipping between chainmail and D&D, depending on the scale of your adventure. So I guess I'm agreeing with you, Mark. I love the idea of when you have something, you sort of break out of the official RPG rule set and into some other rule set, whether it's a tactile, physical thing, or another little mini game or mini puzzle or something like that. It makes it more interesting and lets your brain think a little differently.
Yeah, I mean, the one of the reasons that I had that in intrigue, where you have you come up with a certain thing and I give you the clay, and is it because I don't think puzzles should have a DC. I don't think that it should be something that you just make a roll and you figure it out. And that really goes back to the start of the hobby, where there were no skill sets. Nobody had any skills or anything, and original D&D actively encouraged player knowledge to solve things, because it was still coming from that war game school where you're drawing on whatever your knowledge is, to get your butt out of this problem. That's it. If there's a DC, you can solve the puzzle by making an intelligence DC 15 check, then that's not the way to go.
And this leads into a good question that we got. We had polled some of the audience to email us their questions, and somebody asked, when you play test things you're writing, what would make you change something? So whether it's a puzzle or an encounter or something else, how do you guys take playtest feedback and act on it?
Yeah, sometimes you'll have that one wonderful moment in a playtest where you're like, oh my gosh, all I have to do is do this, and then my thing dies, or the wall falls, or the puzzle happens. So when you see it's, trying to say something that people are going to come up with fairly easily, I don't mind a really complicated or really original solution that's going to blow something out. I'll leave that. I'm not going to, I don't want to close every possibility out. What I want to do is make it where the most obvious things, when I'm coming up against a specific challenge, isn't going to cut it. You know what I mean? I want people to have to resort to clever ways to deal with whatever it happens to be. And if the solution is just something that's just, we'll get that ladder from the last room and just climb over it, or something like that. You're like, oh yeah, no ladder in room 6, or whatever it happens to be, and sometimes you just have to do it a couple of times. But I think that it's worth it to, when anyone in a playtest just takes down one of your obstacles way too easily, take a step back and think, is everyone going to be able to figure that out that quickly? Because then it's no fun, and then it's a waste of time. It's if it's a challenge that everyone's going to do the exact same way, it's going to take the same amount of time, leave it out, cut it out entirely.
Yeah, so totally piggyback on what Brendan just said. I think anything during the playtest that isn't fun or loses player engagement needs to go. You know, if you're seeing people at the table start to space out on something, then get it out, right? Life is too short, right? Things should be engaging. The player should be engaged, especially in an online scenario like this. Stuff has to be capturing things. I guess the other thing for me is, you know, like Brendan said, take a step back. I try to keep my ego out of this stuff, but sometimes I fail. But for those of you that are musicians, I always think of adventure writing like a jazz analogy. You know, when a jazz musician he has a fake book, or sometimes they call them a real book, and all those things have is the melody and the chords. You know, it's not like an orchestra where every part is written out. So any band that plays the tune is going to sound different from looking at the same sheet of music for a jazz tune, you know. And that's what I love about it. But with that being said, I don't want my adventure that's supposed to be, you know, My Funny Valentine ending up sounding like In the Mood, you know. So like if the feeling totally changes, then my intention then I may alter it.
I have to admit, Terry, I don't get either of those feelings from most of your adventures, which is probably good.
As long as you get some kind of feeling, Joseph, I'm happy.
Okay, good.
Write adventure called My Funny Valentine. Nothing.
Now accepting pitches. No. All right. So I have one more here that came from somebody ahead of the seminar. Actually, Chris, this one's probably good for you in terms of converting old TSR adventures to the original Adventures Reincarnated series, but everybody else feel free to chime in too. And I'm just thinking about how the old TSR modules were all like 12 pages long or maybe 16, and when we convert them to 5e, they end up at 300. He asked, I'm going to read a couple that all kind of fit together, but how do you decide how much background material to include, and how do you balance giving the judge enough info to get the spirit of what you're looking for without overwhelming them with a whole lot of options in the text?
Yeah, that might be the holy grail right there, trying to figure that out, because obviously in a role-playing game, you know, the players can do anything. So theoretically, you could design to try and accommodate everything they could possibly do in an encounter, but you can't design that way. That's impossible. And I've seen a lot of people try to design that way, and this kind of ties into word counts, that are a problem, because there are times when you just have to present the encounter, present the environment, present the, you know, whatever you're going up against, if it's a social interaction or if it's an NPC or if it's just monsters, and present the tactics in that, but not you know, set the scene basically for the game master, and then the game master is going to have to on the fly figure out all of those possible options that can be followed. So it's good to point a few of them out. It's good to, you know, try to point out maybe some of the more obvious ones, or maybe some of the ones they might not realize. I think we were talking about that earlier. But it is definitely a challenge to try and, you know, design an encounter to basically set up the framework so that the game master's got everything he needs, but not too much, because you can certainly overwhelm them. And that's especially true for young game masters. There's a tendency for young game masters to give them a little too much information. You know, so definitely a challenge.
I think I don't know if this applies, if I have the tone of the question right, but I think when you're considering like the background of the adventure itself, you know, the kind of that, you know, like the you know, that background blurb that usually is at the, you know, the front of the adventure, which kind of describes what has gone on up until the PCs get involved. I think that is always that's something that game designers have been trying to find the happy medium on forever. Because I mean, there are some, because not every game master is the same. So there are, I mean, there's like if I write a story that has like the cliche like an evil wizard did it. There are some game masters where literally the background could be the evil wizard did it, and then just go on and describe the layer that the evil wizard is in. And there are some game masters who that's more information than I need. You could have said the wizard did it, and then there are other game masters who are like I need more than just I need to know why the evil wizard did it. I need to know like what happened in the evil wizard's childhood that made him an evil wizard. So you have to find that happy medium in there. But like I said earlier, if you're on page 3 of your manuscript or whatever and you're still talking about the background of it, you've gone far too much. So.
Part of that is really working on your language. Really, I think it's we talk about design, but really it's a writing job. And I think using really precise language as much as you can so you can do a rambling 10-paragraph thing that will tell somebody what they're doing, or come up with a tight 3 paragraphs sometimes. Cut all that out and just use the best language as you can, and sort of make everything very, very exact and in a smaller space. I don't know. That to me, that's a goal that I always work towards that I don't always feel I get to, but that's the job is finding that. So.
Yeah, I'm just going to second that. That's a great call. We call it designing adventures or game design, and I think if you're doing board games or card games, there's not as much verbiage, but obviously RPGs are a written medium, and vocabulary and word choice and how you write are really, really important. Somebody mentioned it earlier, but if you want inspiration from Jack Vance, then read Jack Vance and write down the kinds of words he uses, and then use those in what you write. If you're writing stuff inspired by Fritz Leiber, as some of the guys here did, then read Fritz Leiber and write down the way he constructs sentences and takes notes on his word choice and so on. Then utilize that in your own writing. But even in general, as Brendan just said, the tighter your writing can be, the faster you get information to the players and the judge. And if you do a good job conveying a lot in just 3 sentences, then the judge has all they need and they can run with it. And they don't have to spend 20 minutes reading your prose to really get going.
I'm gonna jump in just real fast with because I started running Borderlands based on the 5e version, Chris. For my 10-year-old, my 9-year-old, and my 7-year-old over the break that we've been having. So it's been a lot of fun. But one thing I noticed, because there's an elegance to the original TSR adventures, right? You have a small paragraph with everything you need. It's got stat block in it. It's very DCC sort of style. But one thing I really appreciate about the expansion, just the content that was added for the 5e, is giving an NPC a name. Because one of my worst things is trying to come up with a name on the fly and then remembering it. But you actually added some names to those encounters, and that's a small thing, but it can be so helpful for a judge. And it doesn't take up much text. Just call them something, and then they can create the backstory. Trust the judges to create the backstory, but at least they have one more little anchor point to latch onto. And so I think those kind of things are nice to have, and they can use a little bit of extra space for that.
Good question. Good answer. I'm going to address something that Michael Little chatted to us recently. Hey, Mike, how's it going? He said, what are some common pitfalls that a writer should be aware of when writing and or playtesting an adventure? I'm going to throw out a couple things here, but you guys feel free to jump in. From a writing perspective, actually, it's kind of what we've been saying, but I can't tell you how many times I've gotten submissions that have a lot of background material, far more than you need to play. And I'll often go back and say, cut out 75% of that. And people look at me dumbfounded. But to what you guys were just saying, what you need to really start the adventure is, frankly, like what Mike said, an evil wizard did it. I mean, you often need very little more than that. And any half-decent GM can improvise the rest. So I'd say one common pitfall is providing way too much background information, trying to convey an entire world, or even an entire setting, or even an entire town, when all you really need to start the adventure is a small nugget of a setting. And then you mentioned also common pitfalls for playtesting. I mean, it's really easy to get used to your home group and their way of thinking, and the one guy who's good at puzzles and the one guy who plays a really good thief and whatever it might be. So definitely go out and playtest with total strangers at your local game store or at a convention, and now online, however you want to do it. But I just know from my own experience, it's amazing how your home group will have such a rhythm that you get used to, and then you go playtest it somewhere else, and they either all die right away or they just crush your adventure, and you realize how used to your player group you've gotten. So the more you can get a wide sample set, the better. And I'll turn it over to you guys too. Anybody wants to talk about common pitfalls of writing or playtesting?
I think overcomplicating is a danger. It's very easy to make something super duper complicated. And if you can, I think erring on the side of simplicity is always good, because your players aren't going to have 100% of the knowledge to figure out the thing. It's very rare. You may scatter knowledge through the adventure, and maybe they only pick up half of it. And if you have this crazy Game of Thrones style, plot, it's just going to be really tough. And I've seen a lot of writing where I think people go too far on the side of complexity and not enough on the side of simplicity.
I'll just jump in there, and especially when you're doing this professionally, and you're dealing with real world issues like deadlines and word counts and whatnot. Sometimes you're just not in the mood to write some days, or just not in the mood to, but you got to keep moving forward. So work on maps that day, or work on NPC stats, or work on other parts of it, so that you're still moving forward. But you're not necessarily, you might not be tackling the really tough boss fight or something, because you're just not in the mindset to tackle that. And then wait until you're in that mindset and you're ready to go, and then do that. So that's kind of a little bit of a pressure. I always do that. I kind of have different tasks that I'm looking at, especially on some of the larger the OR projects. There's a lot of different things you can be working on, and it's like some days you just don't feel like. Some days you don't feel like. You don't want to look at stats. Some days, so go write encounters or come up with NPC names or something like that. So
I'm going to add something which sounds really obvious, but make sure you know the mechanics of what you're writing for. It's because it sounds stupid. If you're only going to write for one game system, it's not going to be an issue. But I'm sure maybe a good 50-60% of the audiences here probably has about, 4 or 5 different versions of Dungeons and Dragons in various incarnations drifting around their head at any given moment. And, I came in on DCC back still when it was in alpha. Joe sent me the alpha draft. And I think there's still a couple of rules that I use at my table, which were in the alpha draft and didn't make it to beta. Or, people give me an odd look every now and then, like, I swear to God, I read that, so sometimes it's like, whether you are calling for a wisdom perception check or, an intelligence spot check, or make sure you're not using a mechanic that doesn't exist in the actual system that you're, writing for or you're playtesting, because especially if you're not the one playtesting it, you're going to cause a lot of confusion at the table. Obvious, but should be aware of.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
That's a very, very good point, Michael. There's a lot running around up here from first edition, second edition, third, 3.5, 4, and then, editors come back to you all the time like, I don't think that's a 5e thing. And I'm like, oh, no, it's not. That's 3.5. Sorry.
Tim's ears are burning right now.
Yeah, and this will sound even more obvious, but if you're pitching to a publisher, play the game. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten pitches and I just slash it right from the get-go because they've clearly never played the game. So, yeah. We have about 5 more minutes. I'm going to try to touch on 2 more questions here. One, somebody in the Q&A asked, how do you actually riff from your inspiration for your adventures? And he said he's following the amateurs copy, professionals steal type of mindset. So it's basically how much do you sort of take and adapt and so on. I'm going to throw out a general piece of advice, which is I've learned over the years what goes into my brain is what comes out of my fingertips, I guess you could say. We all know that what you eat affects your health. I actually think what I consume mentally affects my mental output. And one of the things for writing DCC RPG is I just restricted my inputs to basically stuff published before 1979. But for quite a while, I didn't even read modern fiction, modern literature. I just stopped consuming it. I only watched old films. So just be aware, at least for me and maybe for some other people, what goes in is what comes out. So if you're trying to write something that feels like a certain thing, immerse yourself. I mean, you can see my office around me. Immerse yourself in that era or that style of literature or that author or whatever it might be, because that's ultimately what will come out of your subconscious and come into what you write. And I don't know if you guys have any other advice too.
I think that came up when you were giving me some advice on the DCC Dying Earth project, and I was asking about, there's these other publishers that have tried to do some work in this area or publish things, and you're general advice is just don't read any of that, because it's going to filter out even subconsciously, right? And I think that's to that point. So if you want to avoid that kind of riffing on something unintentionally, focus right on the test scan, but don't you're unlikely to duplicate something if it's not entered your mind in the first place. And going back to the source books, is kind of like that's what you want to steal from. You want to steal it from the appendix N authors. You want that because what you're doing is interpreting that for the game, not necessarily taking something directly and lifting it in there. I mean that's so I think that's good advice, and I appreciated that when you were giving me some tips on how to approach that as a project.
Yeah, just quickly, Google is your friend, because when you come up with that name, or like, oh, that's such an awesome name, it's like, this is going to be the best thing ever. Just run that through Google just to make sure that you are the first person to come up with that name, and you're not, inadvertently stealing something that Robert E. Howard wrote in some story, and has been sitting in the back of your subconscious for the last 15 years, and I've bubbled it. I was working on a monster, and I was like, oh, this is the best name for the monster ever. I was like, oh, I can't believe nobody's used this. And I ran it through Google, and I came up, oh, yeah, like 15 people have used this in various incarnations, so I guess we're back to the drawing board. But, yeah.
Cool. So we have 4 minutes, so I'm going to try to tackle one last question, and then we'll wrap it up. Somebody asked, and I know a lot of you guys are chatting other questions and Q&Aing other questions and raising their hand. Sorry we can't get to everybody, but feel free to email us afterwards, or maybe we'll do this again in a month or two. It seems to be, people seem to like it. But somebody asked, there are a couple of adventures like the Purple Planet that have their own separate gazetteers, primers, etc. How do you go about deciding whether you need one, what should be in it, and how long it should be? I can tell you our process may be different from other publishers. I often assign stuff with a word count. Writers rarely obey those word counts, including many of the ones on here. And if it comes back and it's really cool, they usually say, "Oh man, we should do something with that." And that's also why we often are really late releasing stuff, because we kind of spend more time than we should. Just keep plowing in more information, because if everybody's inspired, it makes a better product. So in our case, it's kind of a recursive loop as to what comes back and then what you can do with it and so on. But I don't know if you guys have any other thoughts.
I don't think the intent of any of the stuff is to all of it be used 100%. I mean, we're just throwing things out, I think, to help people's games be better. And if we have other cool ideas, we do it. But even on the Purple Planet, there's a ton of information, but I'm 100% sure that no one uses all of it, and so we just try to provide a bunch of options for people to make a better game.
Yeah, actually, options is a great word, because when you publish 96 pages, it's not like anybody reads it all and memorizes it. And I don't know about you guys, but I'll often, when I get a new supplement, skim the parts that don't feel revolutionary, but then really read in depth the parts that really seem cool to me or something new. And I think I rarely lift it all directly. I kind of assume most customers are like that. I don't know.
I think in this day and age of Kickstarters, there's just no such thing as extra material. There's just Kickstarter stretch goals at this point. I think with the Chain Coffin, I was like, when I did the original adventure, it was like, if this turns popular, I have a sequel. And then the Kickstarter came, and then we had, 100,000 words with Shutter Mountain stuff. So.
That's true. All right, guys, any closing remarks or anything else you feel like you forgot to add before we wrap it up? No? Okay. All right, good. Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and watching us here in the Zoom and here on Twitch. Hope you're having a good virtual con. I think we are, and it's been fun. So thanks a lot, everybody.